All right, thanking God. Just in general this time, let's call Luke chapter 22. You will not answer, for a phrase that literally appears towards the end of the chapter that begins describing the plot to kill Jesus and how the plot to kill Jesus turns into his arrest and eventually his first appearance before the council. Understanding that the first two verses of the chapter describe the way that the chief priests and the scribes are now seeking how to put him to death, but never fear, Jesus has one amongst his 12 that is eager to help. And in verses 3-6, Judas is going to offer his assistance to them, as in verses 7 through 13, Jesus is going to go on about his business, telling those among his apostles who are more trustworthy to go ahead and prepare the Passover, giving them the signs that they will need to know where to prepare the meal and, I guess, roughly more generally how to go about getting that done. As verses 14-23 are going to describe the way in which once the Passover meal is prepared, at that Passover meal, the way that he will institute the Lord's Supper. However, at that Passover meal and that meal at which he institutes the Lord's Supper, there will be, of course, that same Judas who has now offered his services to Jesus' ops, or the opposition, as it is sometimes called today, as he's going to issue a warning, as we've seen in the previous gospel, that as he is probably with some sorrow celebrating the Passover with his apostles, he is warning them that there is one who needs to really reconsider the choices he has made, of course, that being Judas. The rest of them are going to wonder, is it me? Which is kind of a healthy reaction in life. There are times when we hear a warning, and even if it doesn't involve us, it helps, as is common knowledge, or is commonly phrased today, to be self-aware enough to realize that it could be me, because I still got flaws too. And it's good for them to take on that mentality, because even though there is only one Judas in the crowd, the rest of them are still going to be putting their flaws on display, as in verses 24-30. Once again, as we mentioned a few chapters back, they're going to turn back to that argument about who is the greatest, an argument that Jesus is going to once again help them to understand. It's a moot point, because there are levels to this, levels that they have not attained. And even when they get to that level, they're about to go through some very shameful times that are going to expose some flaws. They're going to drive all that desire to decide who the best is. It's going to drive it smooth out of them. But before that, he is not simply going to shame them. He's going to allow circumstances to help them realize how that's a moot discussion. But before that, he is going to give them more credit for the things they've done well than he is going to give attention to the things they haven't. As in verses 28-30, he is going to talk about the future, looking beyond his trials to the time when he enters his kingdom. And because they have stayed with him in his trials, verse 28, he's going to say that he is going to assign to them, as his Father has assigned to him, a kingdom, that they might eat and drink at his table in his kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Cool thing is, in spite of what he knows they're going to do in their own form of betrayal, a lesser betrayal than he's going to see from Judas, he is looking past their flaws to what he knows they can become, their potential. And that's cool to me, because he is then going to have to go on and address Simon Peter directly, saying that Satan has demanded to have him and sift him as wheat. Simon, of course, is not going to believe that he could potentially betray Jesus, understanding that's one of the flaws that is going to be exposed. Jesus is going to make the famous statement in verse 34, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny me 3 times, or till you deny 3 times that you know me. Part of the problem is, as we've alluded to before, the times are changing, and they are going to be driven into places that are outside of their comfort zone. So as much as they might have been loyal in the past, there's going to be a shift in times, and he's going to begin to describe in verses 35-38, where he is going to say the old rules that he sent them out with as the 12, no money bag, all other things, drive out demons, et cetera, et cetera. Those old rules in that level or that time of their ministry, they're not going to apply. He's going to even go so far as to tell them that they need to be prepared and bring a sword. And so with that, they're going to get the swords, but they're going to think that that is for the immediate use, because he's soon going to come under threat. But he's going to help them understand that there is a longer range time frame on his advice that they don't understand completely yet. But before we get there, trying to keep up with Jesus is going to continue to expose why them arguing about which of them is the greatest is kind of a moot point, because as he takes them up in verses 39 through 46 to the Mount of Olives to pray, he simply asks them to keep watch. However, the pressures, the work, whatever, has been so heavy that they're just exhausted and they can't stay awake enough to just keep watch. And so once again, they're trying to keep up with him. He's praying, he's wide awake because he understands the severity of the moment. They're exhausted and they can't stay awake. Once again, making it clear who's the greatest doesn't matter. You can't fulfill your basic job responsibilities enough to make that question matter. As Judas is going to show up with those who are looking to arrest Jesus in verses 47 through 53. They are indeed going to take Jesus into custody, but not before. It's going to seem that some of the apostles misunderstood the time frame of that bring a sword advice, because when I was going to cut off the ear of one of the servants of those who came to arrest Jesus, provoking him to say no more of this, as he is going to heal the things. Heal, he's going to restore the ear. No, he's going to heal the ear. That servant who had his ear cut off, to expose once again the breaking point in the confidence and the experience of the apostles, who once again we're talking about who was the greatest, with the expectation that they had the courage to fight for Jesus, but they did not realize that there was another level that required them to have a level of courage that would allow them to surrender with him. And without anticipating that, they were brought into a place that exposed once again a weakness that made that whole conversation about who was the greatest irrelevant. As we mentioned, they take Jesus into custody, and Peter, if, as he said, the rest of them fall away, he would still stay with him. He will still be with the Christ, following him in verses 54 through 62. But along the way in those verses, we see the famous story of Peter having his breaking point exposed, as well as he will likewise, or as Jesus said, deny the Christ 3 times before the rooster crows, verses 61 and 62 reading. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. As the ridicule of the Christ begins after he's taken into custody in verses 63 through 65, where those who were holding him in custody were mocking and blaspheming him before, in verses 66 through 71, the end of the chapter. He makes his first appearance before the council in a passage that contains our subject verses, basically verses 67 through 68 at least, which read, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. Going on to essentially use that and a few other words he is going to use as grounds to basically say, look, we're tired of looking for evidence. We heard all we want. Let's get him before Pilate, which is what's going to happen in the next chapter. But Jesus's observation about their character, as we mentioned in verses 67 and 68, a kind of catch-22, for lack of a better term, where if he tells them, they won't believe, and if he asks them, they won't answer, brings to mind 2 things. Of course, the fact that in the past we've talked about the ways in which they have begun to weaponize silence. But in the last chapter, I think it was the last chapter, maybe 2 chapters ago, we also talked about the way that God uses time to expose what's really within our character. And the problem is, God leaving us unsupervised gives us a lot of freedom, and we can enjoy that freedom, but also over time, that freedom, if it is not handled responsibly, will allow character defects to settle into our character, rigidly settling into our character. And that seems to be what is happening here at the end of chapter 22, as Jesus seems to have identified a part of their character and is now set, for lack of a better term, quite possibly in hearts of stone. A part of their character that seems to have grown immune to truth. And for whatever reason, the context in which we now see them before the council gathered together in factions from within Israel, seeing the assorted numbers assembled together against the Christ described in verse 66. For whatever reason, it reminded me of the way that over time, when we lose the ability to appreciate and hear and even acknowledge and speak truth, it compromises our relationships because I could be wrong, but in my experience, the less we are able to handle truth, the less we are able to form deep, meaningful relationships. And in the absence of genuine friendships or deep, meaningful relationships, oftentimes what we'll find is what we see here at the end of chapter 22. Shallow alliances based upon common interest. And to the degree that we can find a healthy common interest, that's a great basis to actually start a legitimate friendship where you can actually build trust. But what's happening here is they are settling for alliances that are based upon drama and falsehood, quite possibly bringing up a couple of problems. One, relationships based on drama often, quite simply enough, require drama to keep them going. And so in situations where things could otherwise die down and move towards peace, sometimes you will see the refueling of drama by people who are not confident that in the absence of drama, they can maintain healthy relationships, which may help us understand the way in which Luke describes the end of this alliance, at least in part. As we move forward to chapter 23, I'm going to give a little preview of verses 44 through 49 that describe the reaction of at least one of the centurions, something we've seen in the previous descriptions of Christ's crucifixion in Matthew and Mark, where one of the centurions says, certainly this man was innocent, acknowledging the truth of the situation, what they already acknowledged. They could not form a healthy basis for which to move forward on the crucifixion, acknowledged both by Pilate and by Herod in Luke's account. But even beyond that, the way in which the assembled crowds who had come together to see what was going to happen to the Christ, how they essentially go home in shame. As verse 48 is going to read, and all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, returned home, beating their breasts. Understanding that getting their way did not lead to some new era of peace and unity, even though it says that Pilate and Herod became friends. They were the ones who were like, this is ridiculous. They acknowledged the truth. And as we said, if you can form a relationship based upon a common interest that builds trust, these two relatively wicked men were able to move forward, quite possibly on the truth that whatever this mob was up to, it was false. The mob, however, dispersed in shame, illustrating one of the flaws that we mentioned in alliances based on drama. Once the common interest goes away, reality often sets in, helping us to understand why, as difficult as forming legitimate friendships can be, it's quite likely wise and worth it to seek God's help in forming friendships that are comfortable with the truth. Understanding how exhausting it can be to maintain relationships based on drama.